I found an old rotary phone. It's delightfully mechanical with a dial, bell, and handset, and I couldn't resist opening it up, and once inside, couldn't resist adding a Raspberry Pi. This week, let's look at connecting the phone speaker to Raspberry Pi audio. Hi, I'm Mark Neiman Ross, and welcome to this week's edition of Raspberry Pi Weekly. Every week, we explore the Raspberry Pi and share useful tips. Connecting the phone speaker to the Raspberry Pi is best done through the standard audio connection on a Raspberry Pi. Use a standard 1/8 inch audio plug and connect the two wires. Plug that into the audio jack on the Raspberry Pi and connect one side to ground and the other side to the speaker. The easiest way to tell which lines connect to the speaker in the handset is just to simply open up the handset and look at the color of wires coming out of the back of the handset speaker. In this case, it's green and white. So I've connected the Raspberry Pi audio to the green and white wires coming from the telephone handset. Once you've connected the Raspberry Pi to the telephone speaker, the easy way to check it is to use the speaker test command. Speaker-test. This will send a signal to the speaker, and you should be able to hear white noise coming out of the telephone. If you can't, be sure to check your volume. Well, that's pretty easy, but what do you do if there isn't an audio jack? For example, the Raspberry Pi Zero doesn't have an audio jack. There's also the question of what speaker plug to use. There's a discussion of this plug-in in the Raspberry Pi Essential Training. Watch the first video in the Sound I/O chapter. Since the telephone speaker is mono, not stereo, there's a lot of latitude for connection. In my case, I used a very basic plug, something I had in my spare parts drawer, and was able to send the left channel to the telephone. If you're using a Raspberry Pi, there are two ways to approach audio. The easiest way to connect audio is through Bluetooth, but my phone doesn't have that ability. The second option is necessary to do a bit of reconfiguring and connect the GPIO to the speaker. In the example files is a low-pass circuit connected to a Raspberry Pi that you can use to connect your Raspberry Pi Zero to your telephone. In my case, I built a low-pass circuit right inside the phone itself. Once you've built the low-pass circuit and connected it to the Raspberry Pi GPIO, power up the Raspberry Pi and then open a terminal window. We'll need to add something to boot config.txt. To do that, I'll type in sudo nano, which is a word processor, /boot/config.txt. I'll use the arrow keys to scroll down to the bottom of config.txt. I'm going to add a comment. And then I'm going to add a DT overlay. So it's DT overlay equals PWM-2 CHAN, pin 18, FUNC equals 2. Hit a return, and then do Control-O, which will write this out to config.txt, then use Control-X to exit Nano. This will enable one channel of the Raspberry Pi audio. If your audio isn't working, you may have to use raspi-config to force audio out through the headphone jack. You can't do this through the standard graphic user interface to Raspberry Pi config. Instead, you need to open up a terminal window and type in sudo raspi-config. Go down to Advanced Options, and then go to Audio, where you'll see an option to force 3.5mm headphone jack. When you've selected that, hit OK, cancel, and Raspberry Config will now send audio out through the headphone jack. That should be it. You should now have a working telephone speaker. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Raspberry Pi Weekly. Be sure to join the LinkedIn group and check out previous episodes on LinkedIn Learning. I'll see you next week with more Raspberry Pi adventures.